All right, now we know about our imaginary number I, so let's just look at some examples where we are using I, some multiplication. Just let's get used to how I works. All right, so here we have a negative square root of negative 20. So remember, the square root of the negative is like a square root of negative 1, which is I. This negative comes down, and now I have the square root of 20. Well, the square root of 20 we're going to break down with our perfect square, 4 times 5. And we have 2 square roots of 5. But this negative I comes down, and that's just multiplication out front. A negative I times 2 is negative 2I times the square root of 5. So remember, I just allows us to continue with our math so that we can simplify as far as we possibly can. All right, next one. Here's the square root of a negative 1, so I know that's I. Square root of 4 is 2, and we have this 3 out front, and that is all multiplication, so 3 times I times 2 is 6I. All right, example 6. Here's the square root of a negative 1, so that's I. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of negative 1 is I. And square root of 9 is 3. So then I multiply this all together. 2 times 3 is 6. I times I is I squared. Now in the intro video, we learned that I squared is equal to a negative 1. So really this is 6 times a negative 1, which is equal to negative 6. All right, moving on to our next example. We have a 6I squared, so we're going to square everything on the inside. 6 squared is 36. I squared is I squared. But then we say, oh, yep, I squared is equal to a negative 1. 36 times negative 1 is negative 36. Next example, we are going to square everything on the inside. So I'm going to bring this in. We have an I squared. Square root of 3 squared is just 3. I squared is negative 1 times 3, so we end up with a negative 3. Don't you guys think these are kind of fun a little bit? I think they are. All right, on the inside we have a 5, an I, and a square root of 3. So we're going to square all of these. So 5 squared is 25. I squared is I squared. And the square root of 3 squared is 3. Now this I squared we know is a negative 1. So really we have 25 times negative 1 times 3, which gives us negative 75. All right, last couple examples. We are going to square everything on the inside. So this 3 is a negative 3. Negative 3 squared is a positive 9. And then when you square I squared, or when you square an I, you get I squared. But remember, I squared is equal to negative 1. And 9 times negative 1 is negative 9. Last example, we're going to square everything on the inside. We have a negative 2, an I, and a square root of 7. So negative 2 squared is positive 4. I squared is I squared. And square root of 7 squared is 7. So this I squared we know is negative 1. So we're going to multiply 4 times negative 1 times 7, and we get negative 28.